that if you don't get a good job, you'll get a reputation for being lazy, and then no one will want to hire you in the future. Right? Another thing which is even softer, but I think is very important, is many companies have like a very strong culture. So, I think of myself as a professor at the University of Chicago. Professor at the University of Chicago, I have a responsibility to, be a good teacher or whatever, because, that becomes a part of who I am and what defines for me, like, what is success in life, right? And if companies or institutions try to sort of indoctrinate people and instill in them an idea of what the company's all about, that can help lead people to believe that they have a responsibility to do certain things, even if they're not being watched or paid for it. And that's very common, especially in professions. So when you go to professional school in law or medicine, you take all these oaths, they tell you about this is what a doctor does. A doctor's job is to take care of the patient. And that, at least to some extent, helps give people sort of a moral code which leads them to act in the interest of the people they work for. Another thing that plays an important role is leadership. So Steve Jobs is famous for having inspired everyone at Apple because they love Steve Jobs so much and they believe in his vision to work really hard and to make really great products. So that's sort of leadership that works by gaining people's respect and admiration. But it can also work by fear. If you're just absolutely terrified of your boss, even if he's not going to fire you, you're just afraid that he's going to scream at you if you do anything. Or you just wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my God, if I screwed up, my boss is going to come get me. That can also cause people to work harder, right? Another thing that can work quite well, and Google uses this a lot, is intrinsic motivation and giving people freedom to sort of pursue the things that they're interested in that actually are in the interest of the company as well. So Google gives 1 day a week for every person to work on sort of any project they want, even if it's not directly related to the company's things, because they think that these are people who like developing software and will think of something creative and maybe it will be the next Google product. Another thing that I think is very important is reciprocity's feeling of being a team or being friends or family. So it often makes sense to have people from the same family work together because then they work harder to make sure that someone else in their family doesn't get in trouble, right? And I think the most classic example of this is the military. Probably this is the most important form of incentives in the military because even if people aren't loyal to their country, even if they don't care about us winning in Iraq, they're often very afraid that if they don't act really courageously in a battle, that one of their friends is going to die. And so they spend a lot of time in the military really insulating people from the world and knitting them together into this very strong team so that they'll be courageous just to help out their friends. Economists tend to love stuff like above here, which are like really hard incentives. And they tend to be skeptical of these softer things. But if we actually, see what companies in the real world do, and economists are supposed to believe that the market is always efficient, right? So if you look at what companies in the real world do, they use the soft stuff a lot. So that indicates, if you believe in that these are actually really important things as well. Okay, so here are some of the problems that these incentives try to solve. So one is just people stealing from the company, embezzlement. And this is actually a lot more common than you might think it is. In fact, it's the main reason why most, convenience stores and grocery stores and so forth have cameras. It's not that they're afraid of shoplifting. It's that they're afraid of people stealing from the cash register. And in fact, this is one of the primary reasons why credit cards are valuable. Someone did a study on this. One of the main reasons credit cards are valuable is that there would be so much money stolen from cash registers if there was all that cash sitting around in them. And this is thought to be one of the reasons why Japan doesn't have very many credit cards, especially until recently, because there's so little crime in Japan that people weren't afraid, and therefore it wasn't really valuable to develop a credit card system. And this is particularly a bad problem in developing countries where embezzlement is absolutely rampant. Shirking, that means not doing your work, is another common problem. So that could be you just don't show up for work, or you just don't do any work, but it could also be you're not enough focused on your work. You don't spend enough time outside of work preparing to come to work, or you don't get there on time or something like that. Another problem that has become really big recently is people taking too little or too much risk. So I don't know if anyone followed what has been going on at UBS recently, but there was a rogue trader who basically was low down at the company, thought, look, if I take some giant bet and it doesn't work out, that's the company's loss. I'll get in a little bit of trouble, but it's fine. But if it does well, we'll all become famous and I'll go end up at the top of the company and I'll make a bunch, right? And so what he did is he went off and he placed this enormous bet that went bad, and now this giant Swiss bank looks like it's near bankruptcy, basically as a result of this guy. On the other hand, if you think about people who are very advanced in their career in a very prestigious position, they may have very little incentive to take risks because they don't see much upside of it, and they are afraid of losing their reputation or their career. And that might not be in the company's interest, because it might stop them from doing more ambitious things that might actually be good for the company. Similarly, these issues about how short-term versus long-term people will be. If the company shareholders are saving for retirement, but the company's manager basically wants money soon. Now, there are a number of other, perhaps less traditional incentives that have become important topics in economics recently. So one is called empire building, which is the idea that a manager might not just want even to make money for himself, he might want to become really, really famous, right? And he might want to be really respected and in lots of newspapers. So he might just grow the company, make it big and important without actually making it profitable, just so he can get famous, right? And there's been a number of studies that show that actually most mergers are not in companies' interests. They're mostly driven by the managers wanting to become famous and wanting to be in the newspapers. Maria Melgar, which of the incentives that I listed do you think might be effective to stop people from trying to build empire?
I guess it would be tying the person to the stocks and stocks.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, so I mean, if they have a real personal interest in the company, then they're not going to try to spend so much time just on their own glory. They'll spend more time trying to make profits for the company, and then maybe they can make more money and go and donate to charity, and that they'll get famous that way rather than through the company, right? The interesting thing about this is actually the softer incentives that we were talking about work really bad on this, right? If you give the person the sense that this company is great and it's a wonderful culture and I really, believe in it, well, that's going to just make them even more interested in building a giant empire on this company, right? Another issue that's become important recently is overstaying, what's called overstaying your welcome. Which is that, managers often like to stay in their job and control their company, even when they're not the best person to do it in order to maximize profits. So this often happens in early stage companies. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know if anyone saw The Social Network, he insisted on staying as CEO of Facebook, even though I think it's pretty clear that he was not a great businessman. He was mostly a good technology person, right? And so probably someone who's a bit more grown up should have been running the company. And he should have been just helping out with creative technology ideas. But what managers often do to avoid this is they get involved in all sorts of complicated things that no one can understand other than them, and to make it almost impossible for the company to fire them. Is Isamar here? What do you think, which type of incentives do you think would do a good job dealing with that problem?
Well, like direct management. Like,
So yeah.
well, if if the person's trying to like keep control of like what they're creating, we could probably manage it, but not work. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you were saying was like direct monitoring of what they're doing.
Like monitor, like not actually do the work, but like monitor it, make sure that it's getting done the way he kind of wants it.
Yeah, I mean, monitoring by the shareholders can do some good. I think another thing that's quite popular recently is what's called a golden parachute, which is that you actually pay the person to leave the company. And so a lot of people think this is like criminal. It's like someone did a terrible job and then you pay them this huge amount. But the reason why companies sometimes do that is that they're afraid that if they don't do that, the guy's not only going to do a terrible job, but he's also going to make it impossible for anyone else to figure out how he's doing a terrible job, and therefore he's going to stick around and continue making things worse. Right? Another example that I really like is what's called multitasking. And this happens when there are some things that the company can monitor, and there's some that the shareholders can monitor, and other things that they can't monitor. And the problem there is that the things that can't be monitored, it's really hard to pay people in order to do those, right? And so if you pay people for one thing, they may actually do even worse along the other dimension. So a classic example of this is, in the mortgage market, it's very easy to see how many mortgages someone gave, but not so easy to see whether the people that they gave the mortgages to were crackheads or like people who might actually pay the loans back, right? And so when you pay them just for issuing mortgages, you end up getting a lot of mortgages given to crackheads. And an even more sinister example of this type of thing was that in Colombia and now in Afghanistan, they've been paying people for every insurgent that they bring back dead. So what happened in both places, and especially in Colombia, would be that the military would just go around and kill tons of people and then dress them up as if they were insurgents and claim that they were doing a good job and they got paid a lot for that. So when employees need to balance these things, it's not always a good idea to give them strong monetary incentives for the things you can measure, because that may actually make the things you can't measure worse. So to give you a sense for this, I just want to do a quick little graph. So imagine that there's two things that we care about. One is, on the vertical axis, have you killed the right people or the wrong people? And one on the horizontal axis is how many people have you killed, right? And we might think that there's sort of like some production possibilities frontier between these two things, right? And initially, because you're not giving very good incentives, you're at this point. Can everyone see this? Yeah. So you're initially at this point, which is inside the frontier, because the incentives aren't very good, right? Now, if you give strong incentives for killing more people, you're going to move, you might move to the frontier, but you might actually kill the wrong people, right? So you might move to somewhere down here, right? On the other hand, if you give, weaker incentives, or you do something like try to inspire people that it's their duty to their country to, eliminate the terrorists or whatever, you might not move as far because it's not as strong of an incentive, but you might not cause this problem that they do the wrong thing. So you might move to this point. Now, which of these are going to be more attractive? It's going to depend on what your trade-off is. So if you care a lot more that they don't kill the wrong people, then you're going to have an indifference curve that's something like that, and it's going to be better to choose this point than it is going to be to choose this bad point down here on the frontier, right? On the other hand, if you care sort of pretty equally about the two things and maybe a little bit more about the other one, and you're sort of willing to trade them off easily, then your indifference curve might look something more like this, and you'll tend to choose the monetary incentive, right? Okay, so how a company gets funded has a big effect on the incentives that people in the company have. So one way that a company can be funded is just